Okay, so I was at a high school football game one night some years ago. I love Friday night games under the lights in the cool of the fall, the bands playing during halftime, the concession stand staffed by volunteers, the kids on the field giving it all they got for a chance to play a sport that nobody's getting paid for. And they do it for the pride of just, being on the team. But at the particular game that I was at, there was a play that resulted in a touchdown, but the play was tied to a questionable call by one of the refs. So with 4th and goal, here's the way it went. With 4th and goal, the defense seemed to hold the line. But then a flag came out, and it was a penalty on the defense that gave the other team one more chance. Seconds left in the game. And yes, you guessed it, the offense then converted for a game-winning touchdown with only minutes left in the game. Was the crowd angry? Sure, of course they were. But then one of the parents came down out of the stands, ran out on the field, punched the ref right in the face, knocked him down right there in front of God and everybody. Lots of folks were angry, but only one man acted out his anger and the police had to get involved. One man took his angst to crime. Well, in case you haven't noticed, there's an entire cottage industry right now built around what I call the manufactured outrage. Groups like BLM, Antifa, and others have been joined now by a new group called Indivisible. Yeah, Indivisible. They're the latest band of charlatans taking money from George Soros to manufacture outrage and foment discord. One look at their website will tell you all you need to know. The so-called Indivisible Toolkit encourages people to march on their elected officials' offices. Tell them your demands. Tell them you're outraged. It's nothing but the creation and the channeling of the baser emotions. Anger, angst, fear, futility, desperation. And by the way, they make millions doing it. By telling people that the worst of their fears are realized unless and until they act out their frustrations, even to the extent of sometimes breaking the law. I call this the anger industrial complex. Well, if you've been watching the news lately, you're wondering probably again how the left gets away with so much. I mean, the groups that call themselves Indivisible, they're organized faction of what I call that anger industrial complex. They live and breathe and feed and raise money on nothing but anger. I mean, they organize events and insist that elected officials show up so they can be shouted at. Well, let me just suggest something to you. Being a public servant is not the same as being a public whipping boy. The simple fact that someone is an elected official does not remove them from the bounds of simple human decency. But hey, when all you live for is the next burst of anger, well, that seems to be all they have, by the way. There's a difference in anger that manifests itself in rage and anger that manifests itself in just mere fervency and passion. Well, this past week, Indivisible purported to put on a series of town hall events demanding that members of Congress drop what they were doing and show up to be yelled at. Well, how about no? I mean, what good would that be, by the way? It's like taking one of those crazy emotional retreats that teaches people how to feel better about themselves by getting naked around the campfire and howling at the moon. Except that you want to do it in a local community center and make sure elected officials show up to be the target of your howling. That's pretty much a failed recipe for any event. But then they claim to win by posting pictures of the empty chair and pretending they really showed that elected guy by screaming inside their bubble for a few hours, then going home to chew a few gummies and drink some herbal tea and wait for the next chance to act out their rage. These are nothing more than public tantrums. They're not effective tools for invoking change or for encouraging dialogue. See, outrage, it loses something when it's flooding the zone like that, when there's no result. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the focusing of anger or disappointment will never be a truly effective means for achieving change without being coupled with one other ingredient, morality. Anger that is immoral is also unjust. Anger that is immoral is not likely to resonate with good people who need to be convinced to join the movement. My wife and I were talking about this not so long ago. At some point, we were discussing world events, the former Biden administration's responses and all that. It was so frustrating to watch them just dither along, afraid to offend even the worst offenders, equivocating on this and apologizing for that, and working so hard to be inclusive they never took a stand for anything. She said she had heard a pundit ask in regards to Biden, "Where's the moral outrage?" And my wife's response was epic. I said something in response to the pundit's question, but Charlene said, "No, you got to have morals before you can have moral outrage." Wow, nailed it. Nailed it. Okay, so here's an example of what I'm talking about. You can have a desire or something you want to achieve. You can also be really angry about something or bothered by it, and you want to take action. But how you take the action matters. Remember the old movie Chitty Chitty Bang Bang? Go with me here. It was a 1968 classic starring Dick Van Dyke. I used to love that movie as a kid, except for one character that really creeped me out. He was simply known as the child catcher. Man, that dude was creepy. He wore a long, colorful coat and a crumpled black top hat. He had a long, pointed nose. He skipped along with hands full of candy and a wagon decorated like a carnival ride. And he would skulk around, ringing a little bell, calling for children, promising them free candy and ice cream and delightful treats if they would just step into his wagon. The dude was a full-on child trafficker with hands full of sweets luring kids in. And yes, it was creepy. But it was even creepier when you realize his deception and his trickery. It was being played out on young children at the request of his government. Because see, in the movie, the king himself employed the child catcher. The child catcher was good at his job. He took pride in it. And the king didn't like children. They made him angry and afraid. But he chose an immoral solution to be able to channel it. All right, maybe that's a strange example, but what I'm trying to show you is, yes, you can desire to make change. You can also desire to fix something because it angers you or upsets you. How you do it makes a difference. Look at the anger baiters. Is there a sense of morality coming from them? I mean, I'm talking about decency. I'm not talking about inclusivity. I'm not talking about earnest beliefs. I'm talking about morality. The actual ability to differentiate between right and wrong, to know that some decisions or actions, regardless of your personal desires, they may be immoral if they're pursued. I mean, I can decide that something is worth doing, but I'm immoral if I steal your money to get it done. I can decide that I think something is important for the environment, but I'm immoral if I force you against your will to take part in it. I can decide that I think that kids ought to know certain things, but I'm immoral if I force those beliefs over the wishes of the parents. You see, when you couple your anger with your immorality, it never goes well. We see it in all these non-governmental organizations like Indivisible. We see it in the riots. We see it in the seizing of campus buildings. We see it in the takeover of city blocks, renaming them things like Chop Zone or Chaz or Occupy Wall Street. Yeah, the anger industrial complex stirs them up, and their immorality makes them act it out wrong. Well, then there's the quiet anger. All right, we've talked about the boisterous anger, the one that lashes out. Then there's the quiet anger, though, coupled with immorality again. When people try to act out their angry agendas in subversive ways, kind of sneaky, slide it in there. Like when closet activists pose as bureaucrats and decide to use their trusted positions in federal government to get transgender ideologies in front of kids in schools. That's only one example. And no, I'm not talking about an open attempt to put guys in women's sports. I'm talking about something sneakier than that. Like the time that anger and immorality coupled together with a mandatory survey so that kids had to take to help explore their potential for transgenderism. Here's the story on that one. Turns out in 1992, Congress enacted what is known as the Sinar Amendment. It required states to pass state-level legislation to prohibit the sale of tobacco to minors. The Department of Health and Human Services was then mandated to begin withholding federal funds to states who did not comply within the next couple of years. Over time, all the states enacted their own laws that met the standards Congress had set, but in a never-ending effort to prove their own self-worth, the government decided it must stay in the game on this one. So in 2011, the CDC began conducting the annual National Youth Tobacco Survey. And the target audiences were middle school, high school students. All right, they just want to know how many kids are still smoking, right? Well, yes, but at first. In the last few years, though, activists who masquerade as government bureaucrats realized they had a golden opportunity. They were already getting in front of kids on a congressionally mandated issue, so why not use that as a vehicle to get to kids on other things as well? Why not? It's important, right? They really believe it's for the greater good. They're angry because somebody's lashing out against transgenderism. Well, we'll get in there and find a way to talk to kids. Except they lack the moral foundation to do so. They co-opted the National Youth Tobacco Survey, and they began using it to give instructive descriptions with follow-on questions about transgenderism among minors. You heard me. So one of the questions read this way. It said, quote, "Sexual orientation is a person's emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attraction to another person." These are middle schoolers, by the way. The question reads, quote, "There are many ways a person can describe their sexual orientation, many labels a person can use. Which of these options best describes your sexual orientation?" And then the tobacco survey begins to ask sixth graders to choose if they were straight or heterosexual, gay or lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, or queer, or maybe even asexual. Look, the opening lines of that thing said it was a tobacco survey. And it reminds me of the creepy child catcher, the immoral deceiver and prideful kidnapper doing what his government sent him to do. So yes, the anger industrial complex, it can be overt and violent, it can be covert and sneaky, but the fact remains that anger coupled with immorality is a recipe for bad things to happen. All right, so back to the question of moral outrage. My wife was right. You have to actually have morals before you can have moral outrage. And what I see from groups like Indivisible and other members of the anger industrial complex, it tells me they don't qualify. Anger, fear, loathing. No good decisions ever come from being steeped in that cauldron of boiling emotions, especially when it's coupled by a lack of moral foundation. But yet the U.S. is a free speech zone. I get that. Perhaps the greatest free speech zone in the world. I mean, we enshrine the right to public discourse in our founding documents. We protect them in our courts. But just because you can doesn't mean I have to listen to it, right? When angry people want to yell angry words, their anger can spill over, and Indivisible has been stepping over the line. They've been calling for organized protests. They call it the Tesla takedown. All across the nation, we're seeing a new variant of the Trump derangement syndrome manifesting itself as the Musk derangement syndrome. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, owner of SpaceX, Twitter, X, and Tesla, has suddenly gone from being the darling of the left to their public enemy number one. The deep irony here is that Musk is the world leader in producing electric vehicles, which is supposed to be one of the super causes among the progressive left. But since he aligned himself with Trump and started Doge, suddenly Tesla bad, Elon bad. And the Musk derangement syndrome has begun manifesting itself in things like gunshots at Tesla dealerships and cars being burned, Tesla charging stations destroyed, a rash of individual vandalism with people keying Nazi swastikas into innocent Tesla owners' cars and parking lots. Most notably, Musk says there have actually been threats on his own life. Y'all, that's not speech. That's not speech at all. That's criminal activity. To deepen the irony, by the way, Musk is the one who opened up Twitter, now X, to allow more freedom of expression, but the progressive left is working to crush his freedom of expression. Let's not forget, by the way, that Musk is a private citizen, Tesla's a private company. You want to boycott his company? Go for it. Burning it down is off limits. You see, civilized civilians conducting civil disobedience civilly. That's where it's supposed to be. You don't like Musk? Fine. That doesn't open up your anger to have a physical outlet. Life, limb, and property are being threatened, and at some point there will soon be actual deaths caused by the spillover from the anger industrial complex. This is a real thing. And don't get me wrong, by the way. I love civil discourse, and to some degree, I even appreciate civilized civil disobedience. More so than any other time in recent history, we've been seeing people conduct the very essence of civil disobedience all over the world, as various forms of government, local, state, federal, have all coalesced in some places, or operated independently in others, to curtail the most basic of our fundamental freedoms, things like freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, the right to earn a living. And before any of my liberal trolls out there want to bow up and throw out some lame responses about why they're allowed to riot, let me remind you, there are fundamental human rights typically enshrined in virtually every free society. As a lawyer, I can tell you that we often refer to such a body of unchanging moral principles as the natural law. Certain rights which, whether or not they are enacted by the black letter law of the society, are nonetheless enshrined in the natural sense by God, nature, or reason. But there are limits. And violence and mayhem and threats are where we draw the line. Civil disobedience is just that. It is designed to be civil. Henry David Thoreau argued in his work aptly titled Civil Disobedience that a man must not for a moment or in the least degree resign his conscience to the legislator, meaning you don't have to give up your opinions because government says so. Yeah, that's okay. Your opinion can dictate a response, right? But if you burn my business, trash my reputation, threaten my family, raid my assets, you aren't going to be around long to enjoy it much. It's important that in some form of civil sense, with civility, that civilians find their means to conduct civil disobedience. Every once in a while, yes, the powers that be need to hear no. But I'm not talking about riots and destruction like the left always pursues. I'm not advocating for violence. I am advocating for not sitting idly by, not staying quiet, not just taking it, but there's a balancing act. You see, when the left decides it must destroy opposing views, not just protest them, but actually destroy them, that's when society begins to break down. So next time you hear a group is out there organizing a stand in the public square calling for basic freedoms, maybe add your voice to it. If social media shuts you down, go to a different platform that welcomes dissenting opinions. All the average Joes and Janes out there, we have to make ourselves heard, but if you hear that violent, angry mobs are working to destroy the public square, to take things by force, to act out their anger in ways that no rational person would ever agree to, that's the anger industrial complex stoking that one, raising millions of dollars from people like George Soros, who most recently gave $7.6 million to Indivisible so they can do nothing but stoke anger. Steer clear of those. Because that, my friends, is not free speech. That is criminal activity. And the sooner we put a stop to it, the better. There's no free speech in burning a Tesla. That's my philosophy.